At 10:14 a.m. on July 12, 1944, Sergeant Michael Harrow lay flat on his stomach in the wet grass of a field near St. Lo. The Normandy summer was in full swing, and the air was thick with the smell of crushed apples and rotting cows. Harrow was not looking at the scenery. He was staring at a wall of vegetation that rose 10 feet into the air about 80 yards to his front. This was the bocage, the nightmare landscape that the invasion planners had forgotten to mention. It wasn't just a series of hedges. It was a labyrinth of earthen fortresses that had been standing since the Roman Empire. The roots of the hawthorn bushes were thick and tangled, woven together like iron rebar, sitting on top of mounds of dirt that could stop a tank shell. To the men of the 29th Infantry Division, every field was a prison cell, and every hedgerow was a potential execution wall. But on this morning, Sergeant Harrow felt a strange sense of calm. He signaled to his squad behind him, a simple hand motion that meant hold fast. He wasn't reckless and he wasn't stupid. He was just well-trained. He knew exactly what was waiting for him in that tree line. Intelligence said there was a German machine gun nest covering the crossroads, probably manned by a skeleton crew of exhausted conscripts. Harrow ran through the checklist in his head that the training films had drilled into him back in England. The United States Army had spent millions of dollars and thousands of hours ensuring that men like Sergeant Harrow knew exactly how to fight a German machine gun. They had built mock-up villages and played recordings of enemy weapons over loudspeakers until the sound was as familiar as a car engine. The experts, the men with clean uniforms and slide rules, had broken it down into a simple science. They taught the GIs that the German machine gun was a terrifying but flawed machine. They said it had a distinctive rhythmic cadence, a slow and heavy thumping beat that sounded like a slow drum. Thump, thump, thump. That was the rhythm of the older German guns, the ones the veterans remembered from Africa and Italy. The manual said that between those thumps there was a gap. It was a tiny slice of time, a fraction of a second where the air was empty of lead. And in that gap a brave man could move. You waited for the burst, you counted the rhythm, and then you dove for the next piece of cover while the German gunner dealt with the recoil. It was a deadly game of hopscotch, but it was a game with rules. If you followed the rules, if you kept your head down and timed your sprints, you would live. The experts were so confident in this doctrine that they had actually laughed when they captured the first reports of a new German weapon. Back in the ordnance testing grounds in Aberdeen and the intelligence offices in London, the Allied brass had examined the captured specs of a gun labeled the Maskenenguer 42. When they looked at the numbers, they shook their heads in disbelief. The reports claimed this new gun fired at a cyclic rate of 1,200 rounds per minute. Some reports even said 1,500. To the men who understood logistics and ballistics, this wasn't just impressive. It was stupid. It was a sign of German desperation. The standard American machine gun, the heavy Browning, fired about 500 rounds a minute. That was a sensible speed. It allowed the gunner to aim, it kept the barrel from melting, and it conserved ammunition. A gun firing over 1,000 rounds a minute was a waste of metal. The experts did the math on a piece of scratch paper and concluded that a German squad couldn't possibly carry enough ammo to feed such a hungry beast. They would run dry in 30 seconds. They would be helpless. The mockery didn't stop at the fire rate. When the Allied engineers finally got their hands on a captured MG-42, they looked at it with disdain. It didn't look like a proper weapon of war. A proper machine gun was machined from solid blocks of steel, heavy and precise, like a Swiss watch. This German thing looked like it had been stamped out of a car fender in a garage. It was made of thin sheet metal that was spot welded together. It rattled when you shook it. It had a plastic stock that looked like a cheap toy. The bipod was flimsy. The experts called it the sheet metal snapper. They wrote official reports stating that the German war industry was collapsing, forcing them to make garbage weapons out of scrap metal. They told the generals that this gun was inaccurate, uncontrollable, and fragile. They said that the vibration from the high rate of fire would make it impossible to hit a target beyond 100 yards. It was, in their professional opinion, a terror weapon designed to make a lot of noise but do very little damage. So they printed the manuals. They shot the training films. They told sergeants like Michael Harrow that the German machine gunner was his own worst enemy. They said, "Let Fritz fire. Let him burn out his barrel. Let him waste his ammo shooting at the clouds. Then you move." It was a comforting lie. It turned the battlefield into a math problem that could be solved with patience and courage. It gave the men in the landing crafts and the gliders a sense of control. They believed that if they just listened for the rhythm, the thump-thump-thump, they could dance between the raindrops. Nobody told them that the rules of physics had changed. Nobody told them that the weapon waiting in the hedgerow didn't thump. Nobody told them that by the time they heard the gun firing, they would already be dead. back in the field near St. Lo, the silence was stretching thin. Sergeant Harrow adjusted his grip on his Thompson submachine gun. The wood of the stock was slick with sweat. He looked to his left and right. His squad was spread out in a loose skirmish line, keeping their distance from each other just like the manual said. 5 yards interval, the drill sergeants had screamed. 1 grenade shouldn't kill 2 men. They were good boys, kids from Ohio and Brooklyn and Texas who had learned to trust their NCOs and their equipment. They were watching the tree line, waiting for the telltale flash, waiting for the game to start. Harrow picked out a spot in the hedge where the leaves looked a little too dark, a little too dense. That was it. That was the nest. He took a breath, held it, and prepared to give the order to advance by fire and maneuver. He was going to draw their fire. He was going to make them waste their belts. Then his boys were going to flank them and toss a grenade into the hole. It was a textbook play. 80 yards away, hidden deep inside the root system of a massive oak tree, Jeffrader Hans Muller was watching the Americans through the iron sights of his weapon. He was not thinking about ammunition conservation. He was not thinking about barrel heat. He was thinking about the angle of the field and the way the Americans were bunched up, even though they thought they were spread out. Muller was tired. His uniform was stiff with dried mud, and he hadn't slept in 3 days, but his weapon was clean. It was slathered in oil, the bolt moving back and forth with a slick, fluid grace. Beside him, his loader, a kid named Schmidt who couldn't have been more than 17, had lined up 5 metal belts of ammunition, 250 rounds linked together, ready to feed, and then another box, and another. The Americans thought this gun was a mistake. They thought it was a toy. Muller rested his cheek against the plastic stock that the experts had laughed at. He didn't feel the cheapness. He felt the balance. He felt the predatory stillness of a machine that was built for one thing only: absolute, overwhelming volume. Sergeant Harrow raised his hand. "Let's go," he yelled, pushing himself up from the grass. "Move up." Fire and movement. The squad rose from the grass, 12 men stepping into the open. They were brave. They were aggressive. They raised their rifles, ready to suppress the enemy, ready to hear the slow, rhythmic thump of the German gun so they could time their dash. They were listening for a sound that gave them a chance. In the hedgerow, Muller squeezed the trigger. The sound that came out of the hedge was not a thump. It was not a rattle. It was a tear in the fabric of the world. It was a high-pitched, continuous buzzing roar, like a piece of canvas being ripped in half by a giant or a chainsaw hitting a metal pipe. Brrrrrrrrrt. The noise was alien. It didn't sound like a weapon. It sounded like a machine failure, but the physics of the bullets were faster than the physics of the noise. The rounds left the barrel at 2,500 feet per second. The sound traveled at 1,100 feet per second. The math was cruel and it was absolute. Before Sergeant Harrow's brain could even register the sound of the zipper, he saw the man to his right simply dissolve. Private Jenkins didn't fall down. He didn't clutch his chest. He was there 1 second, running forward with his rifle, and the next second, his midsection turned into a red mist. The sheer number of bullets hitting him at once didn't just puncture him, they chewed him apart. It was as if he had walked into a buzzsaw. Then the sound hit them. The roar washed over the field, drowning out the screams, drowning out the orders, drowning out the very ability to think. Harrow hit the dirt, burying his face in the mud. "Get down," he screamed, but he couldn't even hear his own voice. The air above him wasn't just filled with bullets, it was solid. There was no gap, there was no rhythm. There was no space between the shots to breathe, let alone move. The experts had promised him a boxing match. The German engineers had sent him a meat grinder. To understand why Sergeant Harrow and his squad were currently being erased from existence in a French field, you have to leave the mud of Normandy and travel back to a clean, well-lit drafting table in Germany. The man sitting at that table was not a soldier. He wasn't a legendary gunsmith with a long beard who handcrafted hunting rifles for aristocrats. His name was Werner Gruner, and he was a manufacturing expert. He didn't know much about killing people, but he knew everything about stamping metal. Before the war, Gruner's company wasn't famous for weapons. They were famous for making metal lanterns and household goods. He was a guy who looked at a product and figured out how to make 10,000 of them in a single day for pennies on the dollar. When the German army came to him in 1939, they had a problem that was purely logistical. They had the MG-34, which was a masterpiece of engineering. It was elegant, it was precise, and it was beautiful. But it was also a disaster to build. It took 150 hours of labor to make a single gun. It required skilled craftsmen to carve the metal on expensive lathes. It was like trying to equip an army with Rolex watches. The army told Gruner they needed something different. They needed a machine gun that could be built by unskilled laborers. They needed a gun that didn't require expensive milled steel. They needed a weapon that could be pumped out of a factory like a toaster or a car fender. Gruner looked at the blueprints of the old guns and threw them in the trash. He ignored the rules of gunsmithing and applied the rules of mass production. He decided that he wasn't going to carve the gun out of a solid block of metal. Instead, he was going to stamp it out of flat sheets of steel. It was a radical, almost heretical idea. In the world of firearms, sheet metal was considered garbage. It was thin, it was flimsy, and it was seen as something you used for toys, not for weapons of war. But Gruner didn't care about tradition. He cared about efficiency. He designed a system where giant industrial presses would punch out the parts of the receiver, which would then be folded and spot-welded together. When the first prototypes of the MG42 arrived at the testing grounds, the German infantry officers were horrified. They looked at the rough welds. They looked at the stamped metal parts that had sharp edges. They shook the gun and it rattled. It didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a piece of industrial plumbing. They called it the bone saw. They called it Hitler's zipper. But the insults were mostly about how cheap it looked. It lacked the polish and the finish of the pre-war weapons. It looked like something a mechanic had cobbled together in a garage from spare parts. The Allied intelligence officers who examined, captured early models made the same mistake. They saw the spot welds in the stamped steel and concluded that Germany was running out of raw materials. They wrote reports saying that the Germans were scraping the bottom of the barrel, forced to issue sheet metal junk to their troops. They laughed at the lack of craftsmanship. They didn't realize that the junk was actually the future of warfare. But the real secret of the MG42 wasn't just how it was made, it was how it worked inside. Gruner had to solve a physics problem. He wanted a high rate of fire, but the traditional gas-operated systems were too slow. They relied on gas pressure to push a heavy piston back and forth. It was a sluggish, chugging motion. Gruner wanted speed. He used a system called roller locking. Imagine a door latch that is held shut by two small metal rollers. When the gun fires, the recoil force pushes the barrel and the bolt backward together. For a split second, they are locked tight to handle the explosion. But then, the barrel hits a cam, and those two little rollers are squeezed inward, instantly unlocking the bolt and flinging it backward at incredible speed. It was a mechanism that snapped open and shut faster than the human eye could track. It eliminated the friction and the drag of the old systems. It turned the internal action of the gun into a high-speed blur. This mechanism was the reason the gun didn't thump. A thump implies a pause. A thump implies that the bolt has to travel back, stop, pick up a new round, and travel forward. The roller lock system on the MG42 moved so fast that the cycle was effectively continuous. It was firing 20 times a second. Think about that number. Tap your finger on the table. That's 1. Now imagine tapping it 20 times before you can even blink. That was the mechanical reality inside the receiver. The gun wasn't shooting bullets. It was projecting a stream of light. But this speed created a new, terrifying problem that the experts said would make the weapon useless. Heat. When you fire a bullet, you are creating a contained explosion. The friction of the copper jacket tearing down the steel barrel generates immense thermal energy. At 500 rounds a minute, a barrel gets hot. At 1,200 rounds a minute, a barrel doesn't just get hot. It destroys itself. The physics of heat were the main reason the Allied experts dismissed the gun. They knew that steel begins to soften at around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. They calculated that if a German gunner held the trigger down for just 3 seconds, the barrel of the MG42 would glow cherry red. If he held it for 6 seconds, the rifling inside the barrel would melt, and the bullets would start tumbling sideways. If he held it for 10 seconds, the barrel would actually droop from gravity, and the gun would explode. It was a self-destructing weapon. The experts laughed and said, "Let them have it. They'll melt their own guns in the first firefight." They assumed that the high rate of fire was a flaw, a mistake made by an engineer who didn't understand thermodynamics. But Gruner had anticipated this. He knew he couldn't stop the heat, so he decided to simply manage it. He treated the barrel like a disposable battery. This led to the MacGyver solution that changed infantry tactics forever: the barrel swap. On a standard American machine gun, changing a hot barrel was a nightmare. You had to strip the gun down, use special tools, and check the headspace with gauges. It could take minutes. In a firefight, minutes are an eternity. Gruner designed the MG42 with a lever on the right side of the barrel shroud. It looked like a simple parking brake. When the gunner shouted "barrel," the process that followed was a choreographed dance of speed. The gunner would slap the lever forward. The breech would pop open, and the red-hot barrel would swing out to the side, smoking and hissing like a branding iron. The gunner didn't need tools. He didn't need gauges. He didn't even need to touch the hot metal. This was where the oven mitt came in. Every MG42 crew carried a thick, asbestos-lined pad, usually stuffed into the gunner's belt or hanging from his uniform. It looked like a potholder you would use to take a turkey out of the oven. The assistant gunner, the loader, would grab the hot barrel with the mitt and yank it out, tossing it onto the grass where it would sizzle in the mud. In the same motion, he would shove a fresh, cold barrel into the slot. The gunner would slam the lever back into place. Click, the bolt would slam home. The entire process took 4 seconds. A good crew could do it in 3. The Allied soldiers were taught to wait for the gun to overheat. They were waiting for a pause that lasted minutes. Instead, they got a pause that lasted as long as a sneeze. The wall of lead would stop for 3 seconds, and then, just as the Americans stood up to charge, the zipper would scream again. This capability to sustain such a high volume of fire changed the geometry of the battlefield. The Allied manual was based on the idea of suppression. Suppression means you fire enough bullets to make the enemy duck so your friends can move. It's a psychological game, but the MG42 wasn't designed for suppression. It was designed for area denial. This is a cold, mathematical term. It means that you are not trying to scare the enemy. You are trying to physically occupy the space they want to move into. With a weapon firing 1,200 rounds a minute, the German gunner didn't need to aim at a specific soldier. He didn't need to pick out a helmet or a chest. He simply needed to sweep the gun back and forth across a hedgerow or a road. Imagine a garden hose. When you turn it on full blast and sweep it across a driveway, you cover every inch of the pavement with water. There are no dry spots. The MG42 was a lead hose. The bullets were flying so close together that there was literally no space between them for a human body to exist. A soldier sprinting across a gap wasn't dodging individual bullets. He was trying to run through a solid object. The air itself became lethal. The cone of fire that the manuals talked about wasn't a cone anymore. It was a wall. And because the gun was belt-fed and the barrel could be changed in seconds, that wall could stay up for as long as the ammunition lasted. The German crews carried thousands of rounds. They linked the belts together into 50-round segments, creating continuous chains of death that dragged on the ground like metallic snakes. Back in the field near St. Lo, Sergeant Harrow and his men were discovering the reality of Gruner's cheap manufacturing. The mockery of the intelligence officers felt very distant now. The gun in the hedgerow wasn't rattling. It wasn't jamming. It wasn't melting. It was singing its terrible, ripping song. The sheet metal junk was functioning perfectly. The stamped parts were holding together under pressures that would rip a lesser gun apart. The roller-locked bolt was cycling faster than Harrow's heart could beat. The expert advice to listen for the rhythm was getting men killed because the weapon had stripped time out of the equation. There was no rhythm to learn. There was only the binary state of the world. Either the gun was firing and you were dead, or the gun was silent and you were waiting to die. The German gunner, Muller, was now operating in a trance. He wasn't looking at the Americans as people. He was looking at the way the grass kicked up where his bullets hit. He was walking the fire. That was another term the Allies misunderstood. To walk fire with a slow machine gun meant adjusting your aim shot by shot. With the MG42, walking the fire was like using an eraser on a chalkboard. Muller would see a group of GIs huddled behind a dead cow, and he would simply drag the stream of tracers over them. The high rate of fire meant that the gun pushed back hard against his shoulder, a constant, vibrating shove that bruised the bone. But the weight of the weapon, the heavy steel that the experts said was crude, actually helped absorb the recoil. It sat heavy on the bipod, digging its feet into the French soil, becoming an immovable anchor of destruction. The Americans on the receiving end were experiencing a sensory overload that no training film could replicate. The sound was the worst part. It wasn't just the noise of the muzzle blast. It was the crack of the bullets breaking the sound barrier as they passed inches overhead. With a normal gun, you hear crack, crack, crack. With the MG42, the cracks overlapped. It created a sonic pressure wave that felt like physical blows to the head. It disoriented the inner ear. Men couldn't tell where the fire was coming from because the sound was everywhere at once. It bounced off the trees, off the ground, off the stone walls. It wrapped around them like a blanket. Sergeant Harrow tried to lift his head to see the enemy, to find a target for his own return fire. He saw the dirt exploding in a continuous line, moving toward him like a plow. The line of impact was chewing up the ground, shredding the grass, and throwing clods of earth 10 feet into the air. It was moving fast. It was hunting him. And for the first time in the war, Sergeant Harrow realized that his weapon, his training, and his manual were completely obsolete. He was fighting a machine from the future with tactics from the past. As the engagement in the hedgerow evolved from an ambush into a slaughter, the men of Sergeant Harrow's squad discovered a terrifying truth about the physics of sound. In a normal battle, sound is your warning system. You hear the snap of a rifle, and your brain calculates where it came from. You hear the thump of a mortar leaving the tube, and you know you have seconds to dive. but the MG-42 broke this rule. Because the bullets were traveling at 2,500 feet per second, more than twice the speed of sound, the timeline of death was reversed. The bullet would hit a man, tear through his helmet, and exit the back of his skull before the sound of the gunshot had even left the muzzle of the weapon 80 yards away. The men in the grass were watching their friends die in silent films. They saw the impacts, the blood, and the bodies jerking backward, all in eerie silence. It was only a split second later that the sound wave arrived, that terrible, ripping roar that sounded like the sky was being torn in half. This disconnect between cause and effect shattered their nerves. You couldn't react to the fire because by the time you heard it, the event was already over. The sound wasn't a warning, it was a notification that you were still alive. Sergeant Harrow was pressed so flat into the mud that he could taste the copper in the soil. He was screaming orders, but the noise of the zipper was a physical barrier. It occupied every frequency of the audio spectrum. It was a white noise of violence that made communication impossible. He tried to use hand signals, but nobody was looking at him. Every man was curled into the fetal position, praying to disappear. Harrow realized that the German gunner wasn't aiming at them. He wasn't picking targets. He was employing grazing fire. This is a concept that looks simple on paper, but is horrifying in practice. The gunner locks the weapon's elevation so that the stream of bullets stays exactly 2 feet off the ground, about the height of a man's knees. He doesn't look for heads. He just creates a horizontal sheet of lead that floats above the grass. Anything that stands up, kneels up, or even raises a head to look simply intersects with that sheet. It was an invisible ceiling of death. If you stayed flat, you lived. If you moved an inch vertically, you died. It turned the open field into a prison where the walls were made of velocity. The squad's automatic rifleman, a big kid named Kowalski who carried the Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, tried to fight back. The BAR was a good weapon. It fired the heavy .30-06 round, the same bullet used in the sniper rifles. It could punch through trees and light armor, but against the MG-42, it was a math problem with a losing solution. The BAR fired from a 20-round box magazine. It fired slowly, chug chug chug. Kowalski popped up from behind a dead log, shouldered his weapon, and tried to suppress the German nest. He got off 3 rounds. In the time it took him to fire those 3 shots, the German gun sent 40 rounds in his direction. The volume of fire was so intense that it chewed the log to pieces in front of him. Splinters of oak the size of daggers exploded into his face. The bullets didn't just hit him, they swarmed him. 1 round hit the receiver of his gun, shattering the steel. 3 more hit his chest. He was dead before he hit the ground. The duel lasted less than a second. It proved that bravery was irrelevant when the enemy could put 10 times more metal in the air than you could. Back in the nest, Muller was working with the robotic efficiency of a factory line. The smoke from the gun was thick and acrid, smelling of burning powder and hot oil. It drifted back into his face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't blink. The vibration of the weapon was continuous, a deep buzzing sensation that rattled his teeth and made his vision blur. But the tripod held the gun steady. This was the genius of the design. The heavy recoil of the high fire rate actually pushed the gun down into the tripod, locking it tighter into the earth. The more he fired, the more stable it became. His loader Schmidt was feeding the belts with a practiced rhythm. As one belt ran out, whipping violently into the feed tray, Schmidt was already linking the next one. There was a brief hiccup in the sound, a split second of silence, and then the roar resumed. To the Americans, it sounded like the gun never stopped. The pile of empty brass casings on the floor of the foxhole was growing rapidly, a shimmering mound of gold that was hot enough to burn skin. The links from the disintegrated belts were piling up like metallic confetti. Muller wasn't just shooting, he was watching the beaten zone. This is the oval-shaped area where the cone of fire hits the ground. With a normal machine gun, the bullets scatter a bit, landing in a loose group. With the MG-42, the beaten zone was dense. The bullets were landing so close together that they were churning the soil into a fine dust. He could see the dust cloud walking across the field, moving toward the depressions where the Americans were hiding. He swept the gun left, then right, like he was hosing down a sidewalk. He watched the tracers, the glowing green flares inserted every 5th round, arch out into the field. At this speed, the tracers didn't look like individual streaks of light. They looked like a solid green laser beam connecting his gun to the target. He could literally draw with fire. If he wanted to cut a bush in half, he just painted it with the green beam until it fell over. If he wanted to suppress a ditch, he just filled it with light. Down in the mud, the psychological impact was taking hold. The men of the squad were veterans of training, but this was something else. This was MG-42 syndrome. It was a specific kind of paralysis that came from the sheer acoustic violence of the weapon. The human brain is not wired to process a threat that is continuous. We are built to react to sudden events, a tiger jumping, a rock falling. But when the threat is a constant, unending roar that vibrates your chest cavity, the brain shuts down. The men stopped trying to move. They stopped trying to shoot. They just curled up tighter, trying to make themselves smaller than the bullets passing inches above their spines. One private, a kid named Miller, started clawing at the dirt with his fingernails, trying to dig a hole straight down. He wasn't thinking about tactics. He was thinking about being underground. He dug until his fingers bled, screaming silently into the mud, driven mad by the zipper sound that wouldn't stop. Sergeant Harrow knew he was losing them. He knew that if they stayed here, the German mortars would dial in on their position and finish the job. The machine gun was the anvil, and the mortars were the hammer. He had to do something. He saw a slight depression to his left, a drainage ditch that might offer a way to flank the nest. It was maybe 20 yards away. In any other war, 20 yards is a short dash. You get up, you run for 3 seconds, you dive. But against the zipper, 3 seconds is an eternity. In 3 seconds, that gun put 60 bullets into the air. Harrow grabbed the nearest man, Corporal Hicks. "We have to move," he yelled into Hicks' ear, grabbing his collar. Hicks looked at him with eyes that were wide and empty. He shook his head slowly. He knew the math too. "No," he mouthed. "We can't." Harrow realized Hicks was right. There was no suppression. The moment they stood up, the green laser beam would snap to them and erase them. They were pinned not by fear, but by the physical reality that the air around them was occupied by lead. The devastation of the landscape around them was total. The hedgerow they were using for cover was being disassembled leaf by leaf. The heavy 7.92mm Mauser rounds were tearing through the thick vegetation as if it weren't there. Branches the size of arms were being sheared off and thrown into the air. The bark was being stripped from the trees, leaving the white wood exposed like bone. It looked like a colony of invisible termites was eating the forest at high speed. The bullets that missed the men hit the dirt bank behind them, digging deep into the soil. But they didn't just stop. The sheer number of impacts in the same spot caused the bank to collapse. The earth was being eroded away by ballistic force. The cover they were hiding behind was shrinking. The German gun was literally digging them out of their holes. Inside the nest, the barrel was dying. Muller could feel the heat radiating through the shroud. The oil on the receiver was smoking. "Barrel!" he screamed. He didn't stop firing until the very last second. He released the trigger, and the silence crashed down on the field like a hammer. It was a shocking, ringing silence. For the Americans, it was the moment they had been trained for. This was the pause. This was the reload. Harrow's head snapped up. "Now, move now." He scrambled to his knees, his muscles coiled to spring. He expected a 10-second window, maybe 15. He watched the nest, waiting to see the struggle of a crew fumbling with a wrench. Instead, he saw a blur of motion. A hatch popped open on the side of the gun. A hand in a thick mitt yanked a smoking black tube out of the weapon and tossed it aside. A shiny new tube was shoved in. Snap, click. Before Harrow could even get his boot into the mud to push off, the roar returned. BRRRRRRRT. The window had slammed shut on his fingers. The stream of bullets cut the air right where his head would have been if he had been 1 second faster. He dropped back down, defeat washing over him colder than the mud. It wasn't fair. It wasn't possible. A machine gun shouldn't be able to do that, but the MG-42 didn't care about what should be possible. It only cared about feeding the belt. The engagement had lasted less than 2 minutes. In that time, the German gun had fired nearly 2,000 rounds. The squad was combat ineffective. 3 men were dead. 2 were wounded, bleeding into the grass, their cries for a medic drowned out by the mechanical scream of the gun. The rest were paralyzed, their morale shattered by a weapon that denied them even the basic dignity of a fighting chance. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were targets waiting for the geometry of the fire to finally intersect with their bodies. Muller traversed the gun slightly to the left, hunting for the edges of the formation. He was methodical. He was calm. He was simply operating the machine. The zipper sound tore through the morning air again, echoing off the hills, a sound that would haunt the nightmares of every man who survived it for the rest of their lives. The manual was wrong. The experts were wrong. The only thing that was real was the speed. The silence that followed the massacre was not peaceful. It was heavy, the kind of silence that rings in your ears and makes you check to see if you are still breathing. The zipper had finally stopped. Whether Muller had run out of ammo or simply decided the job was done, the result was the same. The field in front of the hedgerow was still. The dust that had been kicked up by the thousands of rounds began to settle, coating the dead and the living in a fine gray powder. When the American reinforcements finally moved up an hour later, they didn't approach the position with the tactical precision of a combat patrol. They approached it with the hesitant, horrified steps of men walking into a morgue. They found Sergeant Harrow's squad, or what was left of it, scattered in the tall grass. The men weren't just killed, they were shredded. The sheer volume of fire had done things to human bodies that the medics had never seen before. It wasn't like a rifle wound where you have an entry and an exit. It was like they had been hit by a fragmentation grenade that never stopped exploding. The trees around them told the same story. Oaks that were 100 years old had been sawed in half at knee height, toppled over by the kinetic energy of lead. When the GIs finally reached the German nest, they found it empty. The crew had pulled back, slipping away into the maze of the bocage to set up another ambush in another field, but they had left their calling card. The foxhole was filled almost to the brim with empty brass casings. It looked like a dragon's hoard of gold coins. There were thousands of them, a testament to a rate of fire that defied belief. An American captain kicked at the pile of brass, his boot crunching on the metal. He picked up a discarded ammunition belt, the metal link still hot to the touch. He looked at the carnage in the field, then back at the empty hole. The mockery that the intelligence officers had heaped on the sheet metal snapper died right there in the mud of St. Lo. The joke was over. The toy gun had just deleted an entire squad in less time than it took to smoke a cigarette. The aftermath of the MG-42 went far beyond the battlefield casualty reports. It created a psychological scar on the Allied infantry that had to be treated by psychiatrists. They called it MG-42 syndrome. Soldiers who had survived an encounter with the zipper were often rendered useless for days. They weren't cowards, they were just broken by the sound. The sound of canvas tearing became a trigger. If a GI heard a piece of cloth rip or a frantic buzzing noise, he would dive for cover, shaking uncontrollably. The US Army had to change everything. They recalled the training films. They burned the manuals that told men to listen for the thump. They had to admit that they had lied to their troops. The new doctrine was brutal but honest. Do not engage the gun with infantry. If you hear the zipper, you don't bound, you don't flank, and you don't be a hero. You hide, you grab the radio, and you call for a tank or an airstrike. They realized that the only way to beat the machine was to drop a building on it. Back in the United States, the experts at the Aberdeen Proving Ground finally stopped laughing and started copying. They took captured MG-42s and took them apart piece by stamped piece. They studied the roller lock bolt. They analyzed the feed mechanism. They tried to build their own version, converting it to fire the American .30-06 round. But they failed. The American engineers, with all their resources and pride, couldn't get it to work right. Their copies jammed. They failed to eject. They couldn't replicate the loose, rattling slop that Gruner had designed into the gun to make it reliable in the mud. The Americans were too obsessed with tight tolerances and perfection. They couldn't understand that the weapon's genius lay in its cheapness. It took them another 15 years to finally produce a general-purpose machine gun, the M60. And even then, the soldiers called the M60 the pig. It was heavy, it was slow, and it was nowhere near as terrifying as the German buzzsaw. The war eventually ended. The bocage was cleared, the Rhine was crossed, and the Nazi regime collapsed. Werner Gruner, the man who had designed the most lethal infantry weapon in history, was captured. He didn't go to prison for war crimes, he went to work. The Soviets and later the East Germans recognized his genius for mass production, but the gun he built refused to die. Most weapons from World War II, the Garand, the Sten, the Thompson, became museum pieces. They hang on walls or sit in glass cases, relics of a bygone era, but not the MG-42. If you join the German army today, or the armies of Pakistan or Turkey or Italy, you will see a gun mounted on their tanks and jeeps called the MG3. Walk up to it, look closely. It is the same gun. They changed the caliber to match NATO standards, and they slowed the bolt down just a hair to save ammo, but it is the same stamped steel beast that Gruner drew on his drafting table. It is the only weapon from that war that is still serving on the front lines of the 21st century. We tell this story because it is a reminder that in war, better doesn't always mean more expensive. The Allies had the money, the resources, and the craftsmanship. They had the polished wood and the milled steel. But the Germans had a guy who knew how to make lanterns. They had a weapon that looked like garbage but killed like a natural disaster. The MG-42 proved that volume has a quality all its own. It proved that if you throw enough lead into the air, you don't need to be accurate, you just need to be inevitable. So the next time you see a movie where the hero runs across an open field while a machine gun chatters slowly in the background, remember Sergeant Harrow. Remember the men who learned the hard way that real war doesn't have a rhythm. Remember the sound of the zipper, and remember that somewhere in a factory, right now, a press is stamping out a piece of steel that will be killing men 100 years from today. We are dedicated to digging up the truth about the hardware that changed history. We want to find the stories that the manuals left out. If you want to help us keep these archives open, you know what to do. Smash that like button like it's a roller lock bolt. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dive into the weapons that experts said would fail. And tell us in the comments, what is another weapon that terrified the soldiers but looked like junk to the generals? We read every single one. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping us remember the men who faced the buzzsaw and lived to tell the tale. Stay safe and check your corners.